on? Can you hear me? Good morning, good evening, everybody. It's been a day. They are keeping me busy. It is good to be here. Brian, thank you for that introduction. I like to say it's one of those introductions that my wife would enjoy and my mother would believe. I'm getting set up with my paper here. As I reach middle age, I realized I needed reading glasses, but I have absolutely no idea how to look down and look up with reading glasses. So what I've decided to do is put really large print up here. And so I have a bazillion papers of not much on each of them, but really large print. So if you see me shuffling, that's why I'm slowly but surely figuring out what this middle age business is all about. Elizabeth, thank you for inviting me here, and Chase, thank you for your hospitality, Peter. It really is a pleasure to be here today. And, you know, as you shared with me what you thought I should talk about, faith, character, and calling, leadership that transcends organization, I actually struggled with even how to answer some of the simple questions. You know, what is leadership? Who is a leader? How does a leader successfully lead a department, each other, an organization? And if you can do that, how does a leader actually transcend or make an impact beyond his or her organization? And as I thought about that, you know, it's actually, from my perspective anyway, maybe because I'm not a good leader, but it's really hard to be a leader. I mean, it's even harder to be a leader, I think, than to answer these questions. And it reminded me, I was at one of these American Management Association's week-long leadership things, and with other executives. And they teach you how to be a better leader, right? And they teach you how to mentor and how to do strategic planning and create appropriate cultures and on and on and on and on. And over the week, you get to know these individuals pretty well. And one, you know, over time, the kind of the cream rises to the top, and there's this guy that I was really respecting because he seemed like he really knew what he was doing. And I could tell by the fourth day that he was just getting so frustrated. And he used, all of a sudden he couldn't stand himself anymore, and he used a bad word. I won't use the bad word, but he says, God, I suck as a leader. And in some ways, I think he got it, right? I mean, it's really hard to do. We're never going to be perfect. And I gave him credit for understanding. You know, when most people think about leadership, you go to the top, right? So that, from that perspective, Mark Heckler is a leader, or a CEO is a leader, or the dean of the college is a leader. But for me, the definition is different. For me, leadership is not so much the what title you have, or how big is your budget, or how large is your organization, or how many states or countries do you operate in. Rather, for me, leadership is about the how. The most important question that I think you and I can answer is, how well have I served those that have been placed in my path? And from my vantage point, this alone determines who's a leader and how well we lead. And if you agree with my premise, then everyone in this room tonight is a leader. You don't have to wait till you've graduated or you've gotten that job or that calling. You are a leader this evening. And if you agree with my premise, I think that maybe this will provide a pathway into answering that question of how do we effectively weave our faith, our character, our calling into our DNA as leaders. I don't have all the answers, as I obviously continue to be a work in progress as well. But I do think that I can provide some food for thought this evening and hopefully continue it in our conversations after I say a few points. What makes the distinction between how and what's so important is that if you focus on the how as opposed to the what, it's no longer about you. You no longer look inward. Rather, you place that focus out on others, on your organization's mission, on what societal problem you want to solve, which, in my experience then, almost miraculously opens doors, provides chance meetings, allows us to become stronger and wiser than in our wildest dreams. So as Brian mentioned, during the past decades, I've had the privilege of serving on a number of different levels in another number of different organizations and in different roles. And that's the what, right? When I'm completely honest, during these past 3 decades, there have been too many times when I failed to incorporate my own faith, my character, my calling into my DNA. And as a result of this journey, oftentimes in an effort to figure out how I could do better, or how others maybe could learn from my journey, I've written a few books on this topic as well. It's part of, as Martin Luther likes to say, as I continue to work out the salvation in my own life. And as I continue to search for answers, I think I alternated sometimes between being insecure and confident, and am constantly in need of asking for forgiveness. And it's probably no different than anybody else here in this room this evening, and I think we're all blessed. I know I'm blessed that I have a God, a wife, and a daughter who forgives and forgets. But during this journey, I do think that I've learned a few lessons in leadership that I think are worth sharing. Truth be told, I think there were 2 times in my professional life where, upon reflection, I grew the most as a leader. The first was very early in my career, right after I got out of law school, working in political campaigns, working for law firms, and I soaked up everything I could. And oftentimes it was from people, I learned more from people who probably weren't as ethical or as good a leader as I had hoped. And I think sometimes you learn more lessons from those who aren't quite as good than maybe from some of your better bosses. And I can remember bosses who lacked integrity and had little concern for others, or no vision, or maybe were in over their heads, and the list goes on. My favorite story, actually. So I was practicing law in Chicago and working for a senior partner along with some other colleagues, and we were expected and we enjoyed taking out clients for dinner because that's how you got more business, right? And our senior partner was glad to allow us to do that. And so one night, a friend of mine who was another associate and I took out some clients, and the next day the senior partner called us in and he said, "How'd it go?" I said, "Oh, it went great. We think we're going to get some more business, and everything went well." He says, "Well, I need to share something with you." He says, "There's going to come a time when you'll go out to dinner with these clients, and not necessarily this particular ones, but clients in general. You'll laugh," and at the time it was almost all men, sadly, right? And he says, "You'll have a few drinks, and the next thing you know, somebody will bring up this idea, let's go get a prostitute." So we're all looking at each other because that had never crossed our mind. I went to Valparaiso University. I was a pretty I didn't know this came up at dinner. But here's his next statement. He says, "I'm not going to tell you what to do," which surprised me a little bit as well. But he said, "If you decide to go, you'll laugh about it, you'll have fun, you'll call you the next day, but they'll never send you the big case." So in his own warped mind, he had no integrity, right? And I didn't know this before I worked for him. But he could equate doing something that wasn't necessarily ethical and not being trusted in business. You'll never get the big case. The second time in my life when I have learned the most, where I've learned the most, and maybe it's because I'm slow, but it's actually the last 2 or 3 years where I really and truly began to focus on the how. In the past few years, the what's been good. My wife still loves me, the books still sell. Driving was doing well, and at LSS, my day job, we also felt pretty good about ourselves. And before I teach or maybe share with you a few of the lessons I learned, allow me to give you a little bit of that background. At Lutheran Social Services of the South, we had accomplished most, but not all, of what was now becoming kind of a dated strategic plan. And it's time to go through another planning process. At the time, we were serving about 30,000 individuals, and while we could always use more resources, we were doing better than most. Separated into 4 lines of business: retirement communities, children's services, charter schools, disaster response. And if you looked at our short-term outcomes, we were doing pretty well. But if you peeled back the onion just a little bit, maybe the picture wasn't as pretty. So in senior services, the external environment was changing rapidly, and while we could continue to do this for a few years, we probably would have difficulty 5 to 10 years from now. We'd also probably become a little bit too leveraged, and so on occasion we're managing towards bond covenants because of our debt as opposed to mission. Our organization had become a jack of all trades and probably not necessarily a master of anything. Second, we probably didn't have the right leadership people on the bus. There was some conflict. Third, if you looked at the foster care system in Texas, and this is probably true, sadly, in most states here in the United States, it's apparent that our current system currently isn't working. While we could, as an organization, feel good about what we were doing in terms of serving our children that day, and we were doing a great job of serving the children that day, if we couldn't honestly say that we were preparing them to live lives as successful adults. And as we peeled back the onions, we became haunted by the fact that in Texas alone, over 60,000 children were confirmed to be abused this past year. Over 14,000 children were removed from their home because it had gotten so bad. A child who ages out of the foster care system, if they're not permanently adopted, they're more likely to be homeless, they're more likely to be unemployed, they're more likely to not having graduated from high school, they're more likely to be in prison. If you're abused as a child, there's a 30% more likelihood that you will abuse your own children. And so, when we were completely honest with ourselves, as good a job as we were doing, we weren't preparing these children, nor were anyone preparing these children well for the real world as adults. So we began to ask ourselves, what moral obligation did we have to fix the system, to go beyond the typical nonprofit strategy of accessing funding streams and serving well that the system allows us to serve. We deliberated that and talked about, do our short-term outcomes even matter if we can't promise long-term results? And we asked ourselves, do we have the talent, do we have the capacity, do we have the guts, although we used a different word, to tackle this seemingly intractable problem? So after confronting these brutal, ugly facts, we actually made some pretty important decisions. We made a bold decision that as a faith-inspired statewide organization, our hedgehog, in the words of Jim Collins, is to relentlessly focus our mission on breaking sexual challenges, to disrupt the system. That's what we're good at, that's what we're passionate about. And we were driven to come up with an organization and change the system so that ensure that an 8-year-old child in our care or in someone else's care would be well prepared to live a life as a successful adult and then not abuse their children as well. So to accomplish this, we had to do a number of things. We had to fix our balance sheet. So we sold 4 retirement communities, wiped out $60 million in debt, and created a $40 million endowment. We knew we needed better research to really understand what works and what doesn't. The big prominent study in this field is what's called the Chapin Hall study. It was out of the University of Chicago about 20 years ago, but nothing had been done since then. And so to become this thought leader, to really understand what works, we invested almost $1 million with the University of Texas for them to create another longitudinal study that they're in the process of doing right now. What we do know is that any child, whether it's my child or your child or a child in the foster care system, for that child to be successful, they need to be surrounded by what we call the 5 markers of success, each and every part of their growing up, from literally 0 to 22. Those are health, life skills, safety, education, and vocation. Now what happens because of funding streams, you typically only get 2 or 3, right? So a foster family might be really good at safety and health and maybe even a little bit of life skills, but they aren't necessarily great at helping the child catch up on education because oftentimes the child is bounced around from school to school. And so the question becomes, how can we as an organization do a better job of ensuring that each child is surrounded by what we call those 5 markers of success, and how do we change that system so that every organization that works with children can do the same? So we knew we couldn't do this alone, so in addition to being programmatically wide, we had to become community deep. We actually had to work with others. So we're using Austin as a pilot for the past 2 years and have established very meaningful relationships with Goodwill and YMCA, Dell Children's Hospital, the Boys and Girls Club. And so we can use our own specific areas of expertise to ensure that each child is surrounded by those 5 markers. It also means that we can't just simply rely on state and federal fundings. because we need to figure out how to create a new funding to fund other pieces of the solution. So we're becoming a leader in establishing public-private partnerships, working with foundations, increasing our donor base by expanding our external relations strategy. It also means we need a robust advocacy program, right? So we have to work with the legislature to change the system. We made a decision to expand our education presence because as we looked around, very few people were educating these at-risk children, these children who are behind through no fault of their own, because the ISDs, the independent school districts, just didn't seem to know how or want to care for these kids. So we now have 13 education campuses and we're in the process of creating more. We made a decision that if we were truly serious about achieving our mission, we had to change our brand. We led with the Lutheran name. In Texas, 1.5% of all Texans are Lutheran. We needed a brand that invited everybody to join us in this cause. We learned through research that your generation and the millennials think that a social service means a government work. They didn't like that part of our brand. And I don't know if is anybody here from Texas? Texans do not like to be called of the South. And so that we were 0 for 3. So we went to Upbring, and it seems to be working. We also had to be smarter about where we put our limited resources. So we've been partnering with some children's hospitals and some for-profit organizations and using big data to pinpoint exactly where abuse is going to occur in a particular neighborhood. It's fascinating research. So I was looking at the research yesterday for the city of Austin. We know the neighborhood, but we can almost pinpoint the exact street where abuse is going to occur based on 9 different factors. Now, one of the lesser important ones is poverty, but they typically occur in those areas. But the most important piece is if that street, there's a lot of violence on that street, they're more likely to be the trauma and the violence associated with children as well. So once we know which neighborhoods there's abuse occurring in, we can put the preschool on that neighborhood. We can provide the wraparound services. We can work with the families and help them on some occasions move out of that neighborhood so that they can have a decent chance. We're almost 2 years into this journey. We think this is a journey that will take 7 to 9 years before we truly understand if what we are attempting to do will work. But the good news is, I think in the last first 2 years, as we measure our metrics, we've been a little bit over 90% successful. So the question becomes, what leadership lessons can be gleaned from this journey? What I learned in the last few years is that for me to fully embrace the how, I must change the way that I live. So most of the ideas that I just described came from colleagues that are younger than me, spent most of their time in other industries, for-profit, non-profit. They're change agents. And while they respect the past, their only goal is to disrupt and reform. And so for me to continue to add value, I must change the way I think, I must change the way I manage, and maybe even allow others to begin to assume the mantle of leadership. I must focus not necessarily on instructing my colleagues what to do, because I don't think they need that anymore, but rather on how well I can serve them so that they can accomplish their goals. And I learned also that if we truly want to, as one of my colleagues likes to say, make a ding in the universe, which is what we're trying to do, I have to focus more on beyond the walls of my own organization. So my colleagues and I were increasingly shifting our time and our energy to what the academicians call meta-leadership. So meta-leadership, it describes that movement from transforming your own organization to, in addition, creating shared outcomes with other organizations, whether it's the YMCA or corporations or funders or academia or Department of Family and Protective Services. And as a collaborator, you can't force them to adopt your goals. You can't force them to do what you ask them to do, but you truly have to understand how we can better serve them, how we can get them committed to a shared goal and mission so that collectively we can break the cycle of child abuse. So it takes different skill sets, right? As we move from driving results within our own organization to driving results across a host of organizations. Another aspect of our meta leadership role is that we have to focus on changing the societal conversation. As an organization, it's incumbent on us now to proactively educate and encourage the legislature, the governor's office, the media, to help us with our agenda and to change the conversation. And oftentimes, where we're most successful in doing this is when we get absolutely no credit for anything that's done. So we'll quietly provide the governor's office with an evidence-based strategy that works and allow him to make the announcement and take the credit for what a great idea that he just had. We'll plant some seeds with a particular media outfit so the right message effectively gets communicated. Another lesson that I think I would probably say I relearned is that as a leader, it's incumbent on all of us to follow the golden rule. And it's pretty easy to say, right? So in everything you do others, do to others what you would have them do to you. But I've rediscovered that by focusing on the how, by following the golden rule, as a leader, I'm almost effortlessly able to incorporate the gospel values of love and honesty and respect and justice into my daily decision-making and actions. And, you know, following the golden rule, which is nothing more in some ways than how well have I served those who've been placed in my path today, adds lasting value because it's other-directed, not self-centered. It builds people up as opposed to uses them up. It allows people to envision new possibilities both within themselves and within the organization. And it invites decision-making based on one's own values. And it allows everyone in the organization to reveal their own inner ideologies without forcing others to conform to the belief of others. I was speaking to a CEO of a Fortune 500 organization recently, and he said that during his time at the Harvard Business School, in addition to learning some rocket-powered financial models, the most important lesson he learned was if you want to succeed long-term in business, you follow the golden rule. What's interesting to me as well is that it's not a rule that's unique to Christianity. Every major religion has a similar verse, right? The Torah, the Quran, the Buddhists, the Muslims, the Native Americans, the Unitarians. And it's a philosophy that millennials relate really well to, as long as you're consistent in your approach. And so the other day we had a conversation with a group of our managers, and they were pushing back saying our employee policies aren't consistent with our values. If you really trusted us, your employee policies would not be this strict. They were probably right, but it was a great example of how everything that you do in your organizational culture has to be your values. And there's so many examples, even recently, of just companies who continue to get this wrong, right? So Wells Fargo, if you've been reading the paper, the EpiPen example that's in the newspaper. I don't know if many of you watch movies, but if you saw the Deepwater Horizon, it's the difference between the Mark Wahlberg character versus the VP manager. Or we talked about it in one of the classes earlier today, the intro. The Robert De Niro character getting it more than anybody else. You know, another thing, I mentioned the golden rule, but in the need and the importance of bringing diversity on into your organization. And we have found as a traditional Lutheran organization that we have just blossomed when we began to really focus on embracing diversity at every single level, whether it's age or experience or socioeconomic or lifestyle or religion, ethnicity, gender, that this has added so much value in terms of us coming up with solutions to fix and to help with a complex society. So we're actually starting to talk about what people call the platinum, and that is to treat people how they want to be treated, not how you want to be treated, but how they want. To succeed at the how, we must embrace change, and it's the easiest thing for all of us to say until it impacts personally each of us, and then we don't like it. As I got in my 50s, and I became very much attuned to a fork in the road that popped up and seemingly out of nowhere, where, you know, I realized as a 53-year-old leader that I was either doomed to mediocrity as younger, ambitious, technology-infused generations passing by, or I could take a step back and acknowledge my shortcomings and reinvent myself as a grace-filled child of God. And what I found is that I could simply no longer rely on what had made me successful in the past. Times had changed, I had changed. I had to reinvent myself. And there's a book out there called The Mindset, The Psychology of Success by Carol Dweck that I'm sure some of you have heard. And, you know, she finds that individuals succeed or fail based on how they think of their own intelligence. And she says that people have one or two mindsets, right? So the first are the people with the fixed mindset. And those people, they'll avoid challenges, they'll be threatened by potential or negative feedback, they'll typically exert less effort. The second group is that group with the growth mindset. So these people believe that intelligence can be developed like a muscle. And so if you're in this camp, the research will shows that you'll test yourself more despite the risk. You'll be more inclined to accept criticism because it'll ultimately make you better. You perceive hard work as a path to mastery. You're not afraid to fail. And you actually look forward to being evaluated by your peers. I think for each of us to continue to serve well, we have to relentlessly focus on improving. I shared this earlier today, but some of you here at Valpo know a good friend, former colleague here, John Nunes. Some of you may have had him in class, and he's one of my mentors. And he has pushed me as my mentor to meet one new person every day and to learn one new thing every day. That's really hard to do, but if you make that your habit, your ritual, all of a sudden you'll find a lot of things opening up in your life. There's a book, Jim Lear, who is an author, he's written several books. One of the books that he's written is called The Power of Story. And he urges you to look at it like this. So all of us here, it's pretty easy to talk about our purpose. What is our purpose in life? Whether it's your purpose in terms of your major as a student, your purpose as a professional, your purpose as a family member. And we can all put those down pretty easily. Now here's the hard part. Is what I'm putting down, is the story that I'm telling actually true? Where are the gaps? What parts of the story that I'm telling are made up? So, you know, I wanted to get into grad school, but I play video games all night long, so I don't get a lot of sleep. And so that's the piece that's not true, right? I want to have a great relationship with my daughter, but I find myself working late every single night at work. And then the question becomes, how do you, rituals, what habits do you instill in your life to close those gaps? So I was talking to a business leader in Florida, and he's telling me that his gap was football. And I said, how's this? He said, well, I wanted to get more involved in my community and my college, but I was letting football get in the way. And he said, you know, in Florida, like Texas, Friday night football is king because of the high school football. Saturday, you watch all of the college football games. On Sunday, you watch the professional football games. On Monday, you got Monday night football. You got Thursday night football. Now you got fantasy football. He was letting football get in the way of achieving his calling. So he gave up football. And he said, you know, Kurt, the funny thing is, what I learned is that the same team wins no matter if you watch the game or not. You know, as we learn how to serve well those who've been placed in the path, I actually think it's useful for us both individually and as an organization to think about our present and our future in what I call the two curves. So in the business world, we talk about the Sigmoid Curve. And for almost all businesses, including Valparaiso University, Upbring, congregations, any for-profit company, it goes like this, right? But because it changes in the external world, if you don't adapt yourself, pretty soon you're going to find yourself going down pretty quickly on the roller coaster down. So the question is, how do you adapt to continue to have a vibrant organization? So that's why, for example, you'll see churches in changing neighborhoods who are dying because they can't adapt to the neighborhood. I worked sometimes these changes come completely out of the blue. So years ago, after 9/11, I was asked to go speak to some executives with Air Jamaica. 9/11 blew their business model apart because nobody was flying anymore after 9/11. and they had to very quickly figure out how to reinvent themselves. The same thing is true with ourselves. So as a business, not only do you serve well those who've been placed in your path today, you're always reinventing yourself to continue to be relevant 5 years from now. I think the same things are true for us as individuals. So as a college student, I think it's sometimes easier for you guys to look out 5 years, say, you know, I want to be a teacher, I want to be an accountant, I want to be a doctor. But sometimes I think we forget that we've also been called well to serve those who've been placed in our path today. So whether it's your roommate or your customer at a part-time job or your professor or your family, it's both and. So in my example, for my situation, if I want to continue to be successful as a leader, I have to understand the changes in technology that are occurring today. So the idea is, not only do we serve well today, but what habits and rituals do we instill in our lives today so that we will be, God willing, successful 5 years from now, whether they're habits of health, habits of being in God's Word, habits of learning something new. I also think that leaders that excel at the how understand that every aspect of their vocation is important. So I love the Lutheran perspective of vocation, where church and community and profession and family are all equally important. In today's culture, however, it's really difficult for those of us who work outside the home, or for those of us who are students and balancing work as well, to have a balanced professional and family life. And one of the reasons this is so difficult is the environments of the work and the home are so different. So the dynamic that goes on at work has the potential to involve everything else in life. So when we walk in the office, we're met with, you know, overlapping daily, weekly, quarterly, yearly deadlines, and we're expected to produce specific outcomes or we're considered a failure. It's also a place where we probably have our most energy. We look our best, we're put on a pedestal for our skills and successes, and it can be very gratifying and ego-building, a seductive environment. And you contrast this to home. We walk in the door, we're tired, we're consumed by the pressures and deadlines of work, the house is a mess, we rarely feel our children are putting us on a pedestal. And all of the internet and iPhones and emails keep us from spending quality and quantity time with our loved ones. And unlike work, there really aren't any quantifiable outcomes by which we are measured on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and yearly basis. And they're more squishy, right? They're less tangible, hard to measure outcomes like the family, you know, the quality of our family relationships. But it doesn't make these outcomes any less significant. And as an example, my wife and I, we have now a 21-year-old daughter, but at the time, we were looking at the research. And you know, the research exists that shows that if I'm physically and psychologically absent from home, some very negative real outcomes are more likely to occur in our daughter. So in a home where a father is absent, a teenage girl is 3 times more likely to engage in sexual relations before she's 15. In a home where a father is absent, the teens are at greater risk for illegal drug use. In a home where a father is absent, children have a higher rate of asthma, anxiety, depression, and behavioral problems. Now, there's also compelling evidence that leaders who balance their lives, in addition to having a better family life, they're more productive, they make better bosses, they're more rounded, they're more creative, they're overall more effective. It's one of the research's many ironies where if you want to be successful in business, have a great home life. I'm going to share with you a leader who got the how. You know, it's this story of the Good Samaritan. And, you know, Jesus talks about how a certain man fell among thieves, and 3 men passed, 2 on the other side, and finally another man came and he helped the injured man on the ground. And so often we hear that the priest and the Levite were just in a big hurry to go to some synodical or ecclesiastical meeting, and they simply didn't have the time. However, when we're completely honest with ourselves, even though we like to make fun of them, we probably do this ourselves every day. We're too busy to notice those who are hurting around us, maybe even those in this race tonight. But Martin Luther King, in a book he wrote titled The Measure of a Man, he talks about this event in a different light. And he talks about how the Jericho Road is a dangerous road, and that the same thing happened to the man who was beaten and robbed. It could have happened to the priest and the Levite. crucified. And Martin Luther, King, imagines that the first question that the priest and Levite asked was this: if I stopped and helped this man, what would happen to me? Now the Good Samaritan comes by, in the very nature of his concern, by the very nature, he reverses that question. He says, if I do not stop and help this man, what will happen to him? And so the Good Samaritan was a great leader because he had the mental equipment for dangerous altruism. And the Good Samaritan was a great leader because not only had he ascended to certain heights of economic security, he could also condescend to the depths of human need. And the Good Samaritan was a great leader because he could surround the length of his life with the breadth of it. So I think as we continue as leaders, we are called to cross geographical, cultural, religious boundaries to help our hurting neighbor. We're reminded that while we're in the world, we're not